Visx, it's another React library built on top of D3. In terms of the size of the library, as you can see here, it takes about 91.12 kilobyte regular size and parse 42 kilobyte. So it's much smaller if we compare it to Recharts, which takes 432 and about half of that parsed. It supports TypeScript, it supports modules, so you can import each element on its own. It has mock data, so we don't even have to bring data just to test it and create proof of concept. In terms of simplicity, it's not that easy to work with because you're working with element and you have to kind of put them together. So you really need to have good understanding of their architecture and how to build the component. However, it does come with styling already, so you don't need to style that. The documentation is great, the examples are great, a lot of contributors. The popularity, as I said, is the second, and not that many open issues. So if you go to GitHub, you'll see it has about 13.2 started, about close to 500 people forked it, about 75 issues. Then they have vis-x, that the library is built by Airbnb. So if you go to airbnb.io/vis-x, you can see a gallery, and they show you different example of what you can do and how to work with it, and examples. So it's a great library, and it's a good option because you can really take the element and only the elements you need, and it's built as modular. And in terms of our example, we're going to be creating an histogram similar to what we build on our own with D3. And we're just going to write really minimal code just to create the histogram so you can see the example, and we're going to use the mock data out of the library itself. As I mentioned, Visx is built on modules, so we need to bring all the module we'll be using. So we need the mock data, we need the group, we need the shape, and we need the scale. So use yarn add and add all those libraries. Then inside of component, we're going to create a new folder, and let's call it simple bar graph. And inside we're going to create another file, and we'll give it the same name, simple bar graph tsx. Okay, now we can create, we're going to create a function component, and we're going to give it the same name, simple bar graph. So let's create our constant and create our function component. We don't need any interface, but we do need to export our default function, and then we need to return it has to be a round bracket, and then we need to return the element. The element we're going to return is going to be a type of SVG, just like we did with Recharts. Okay, we can collapse it for now. Okay, now when we build this component, we can really use the similar approach of how we build our library in our basic examples. And what we can do is we can set the data, so we can create a constant to hold the data, and instead of using recoil or an object, we can use the built-in mock data into vis-x. It's called letter frequency. So you can see it's built right into vis-x, and that's gonna bring some data so we can work with. And then if you remember, we created the dimension that was made out of the width, the height, the margin. So we can create the same thing, just use width 500, height. You can use the helper we created, but I want to just create a standalone minimalistic example, so we don't need all of that. So we need to just set all the variable. For the top, I put 20. The bottom, let's put 20. Let's put all of them 20. Left 20 and right 20. Okay. Now that we have the dimension values, we create our bounds. So for the bounds, we can create a constant and call it bound x and bound y. So that's the maximum value for the x and maximum value for the y. So that will equal the width minus the margin on the left and minus the margin on the right. And the same with the y, we need to use the height minus the margin on the top minus margin on the bottom. Okay, and now that we have the bounds, we can create our x and y, x scale and y scale. So for the x scale and the y scale. Now for the x scale, we can use, and the range band is for the x, so we're going to create the band. So it needs a couple things. It needs the range and it needs the domain. And the same with the y scale. So the y scale, it's just a linear numbers, right? So we can use the scale linear, and then it takes also a range and a domain. Oops, it needs to be an object, not an array. Okay. Now to create our x scale, we need, just like we did when in our example, we need to create some kind of accessors. So we need the x accessor and the y accessor. So we can create constant x for the x accessor, and then we can assign it the metrics to the letter. That's from the mock data, and then we can assign in an inline function the d letter. And for the y scale, for the y accessor, we're going to use the same. We're going to use the d, but this time we're going to take the frequency and that's of type React key. And to get that, we're gonna take the data frequency and multiply it by 100. So this, you can look into the mock that comes out of the box from Visx. Let's see, just make sure. Okay. Oops, I have a typo in frequency. Frequency. Okay, so now that we have our accessors, we can use our accessors with the bound to create, oops, let's see what, it's throwing an error. We need to throw, okay. We need to put a ts-ignore because the type, so it needs to be the same type int. So we're just going to ignore that. And then for the x scale and the y scale, now we can use our bounds and we can use our accessors. So for the x scale, the range is going to be from 0 to the bound of our x. And for the y scale, it's going to be our bound of the y, because we're starting, from the top and down to 0. So bound y and 0. And then for the domain, the x scale, we can map through our x accessor to create for us the domain. And for the y scale, we need to get the maximum height. So we can use max, and we can pass in we can extend our data using the ... map and pass the accessor. So you can see, if you understand really D3, this is not different than everything we've done so far. The problem is, if you don't understand D3, it's going to be really hard for you to work with it, because you won't know what it all means. So really having a strong understanding with D3 can really help you big time with the vis-x. Then we can round the number. So this is similar to what we did with D3, that we just said nice. So this will round the number, and we can add the padding. And if you remember, when we created our histogram, we did the same thing. We added the padding. So we can add the padding to each bar. And then for the Y scale, just like with D3, how we did nice, we can round the number. Okay, so now that we have the X scale and Y scale, we need to create a compose that will take the scale and accessor, and then we'll be able to spit out points. So we can create another constant and call it compose, and it will expect a scale and it will expect an accessor. And it's gonna spit out our data using the scale and the accessor we're passing. The type is going to be really, we want any type, because we want to reuse this in case we're building something else. So I'm just going to put a ts-ignore. I'd rather put ts-ignore than any, because ESLint won't, it's set up not to let us use any anyway. And now if I want to create my points, so if I want to create my X point, I want to create my Y point, I can just use that compose we created. So we're gonna use compose, and then we're gonna pass the X scale and the points we wanna get. In our case, we want to get the X point, so we can use it, the X and the Y, so we can use it when we draw a chart. And the same with the Y point. We just need the Y scale with the Y value. And now we have all the elements to really start creating our chart. So inside of our SVG, when we render it, what we can do is we can map through our data, and then we can pass in the data and the index, and then we can map through our value and create vis-x, called a group. So you need to import the group element from vis-x, and we need to use what vis-x call a bar. Okay, and then we need to just set it up. For the group, what we need to do is the only thing we need to do, because it's a map, it really requires that we set a key. So for the key, we can use the UUID, just like we did before, using the React UUID library. So under our import, we can add another constant called UUID, and it will require React UUID. And then we can give it a name. We can call it, let's say, I'll use a template name, a template style, and we can call it bar-UUID. Okay, that's for the group UUID. Okay, and we need to return this whole JSX component. What we can do, we can extract it to its own function component, but it's not necessary because it's just a little code. But if it was more code, I would have extracted it to its own function component. And now inside of the bar, what we need to do, we need to set all the properties. So the properties in the bar, we need the X, we need the Y, we need the height, we need the width, and we need the fill. So let's take a look. For the X, we can just use that X point we created, and the X point already converted to the pixel that we need. For the Y is really the size of the bound minus the height of the bar. So we need to calculate the height of the bar. So it needs to be the bound, our Y bound, minus the size of our bar. So to calculate the size of our bar, we can do it here before the return. We can create a constant and call it bar height, and it would equal the bound Y size minus the Y point for that data point. And we can then, this is the actual bar height at that data point. So we'll take the bound and then we remove that to get the location of the bar. And then for the height, we can use the bar height. And for the width, we can actually use our scale, X scale, and just like with what we did when we created our histogram, we can use the bandwidth, and that will calculate for us the width. For the color, I'm just going to use gray color. There you go. Let's see if it's complaining about the X. Let's see why. Yeah, because for the X point we need to pass the data, so it's going to calculate for us the X point location for that data that we're using. So don't forget to add that. And we should be good to go. See that there's no errors. Now go back to app TSX and let's add a component, simple bar graph. What you can see for the rechart, I commented out, so I'm putting everything inside of the app TSX, all the example we're going to create. This we can comment and uncomment the different examples. Now let's go to local 3000. And it looks like it fails. It's just showing one bar. Let's take a look why. It looks like the SVG, I didn't assign it a width and a height. So without a width and a height, it's all aligning on the same line bar. So let's just add that. And then let's go back to port 3000 and refresh. Let's take a look. Great. So you see we got our histogram, and it's, it's really, if we look back at the code, it's very similar to D3. It's so similar to D3 that, in my opinion, if you have this level of knowledge and you need to put the component together, it sort of beat the purpose of even using this library in some ways, because it's so similar to D3. So that's the disadvantage. Why use this library if you can just use D3? At the same time, it has a lot of stuff built into it that I haven't even showed you. So if you're looking to build something that is really similar to what they have, and you can easily adjust it and it match your need exactly, this is a great library. So it's good to keep in mind and to really check their example and see if the charts that they're building is really similar to what you're trying to build